The stagecoach lurched to a stop in front of the rough timber building that served as Grass Valley's general store, and Katherine Rosewood stumbled out onto the dusty California street, her legs unsteady after 3 weeks of traveling from Boston. No one offered a hand to help her down, and when she reached for the door to the store, she had to yank it open herself while juggling her carpet bag and the worn leather satchel that held everything she owned of value. The door nearly slammed back into her face as she struggled through, and she caught it with her hip, wincing at the impact. This was 1867, and Katherine had just learned her first lesson about the West. Out here, a woman was expected to fend for herself. She had come to Grass Valley because her brother Samuel had written to her 6 months ago, describing the opportunities in this gold mining town nestled in the Sierra Nevada foothills. He had promised her a place to stay and a respectable position helping him run his assay office. What Samuel had failed to mention in his enthusiastic letters was that he had died 2 months ago in a mining accident, and his business had been sold to pay his debts. Katherine had discovered this information only after arriving at the address he had given her, finding a tobacco shop where his office should have been. The man behind the counter of the general store barely glanced at her as she approached. "Help you?" he asked, his tone making it clear he would rather she simply state her business and leave. "I am looking for information about lodging," Katherine said, trying to keep her voice steady despite the panic rising in her chest. "Respectable lodging for a single woman," the man snorted. "Respectable lodging for a single woman in Grass Valley? You might try Mrs. Henderson's boarding house on Mill Street, but she doesn't take in women without references or means of payment." His eyes traveled over Katherine's dusty traveling dress with obvious skepticism. "You got money?" Katherine felt her cheeks burn. She had exactly $17 remaining after her journey, and she had no idea how long that would need to last her. "I have means," she said stiffly. "Where is Mill Street?" He jerked his thumb toward the window. 3 blocks that way, then turn left. Big white house with green shutters. Can't miss it." Katherine gathered her bags and turned toward the door. She reached for the handle just as it swung open from the outside, and she had to step back quickly to avoid being hit. A man filled the doorway, and Katherine's first impression was of sheer size. He stood well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders so broad they nearly touched both sides of the frame. His dark hair fell past his collar, slightly damp with sweat, and his shirt sleeves were rolled up to reveal forearms corded with muscle. He had clearly been working hard at something physical, and he smelled of pine sap and honest sweat. What struck Katherine most, however, was that he stopped immediately when he saw her. He did not push past her or expect her to move. Instead, he took a step back, held the door open wide, and gestured for her to pass through. "Madam," he said simply, his voice a deep rumble. Katherine stared at him for a moment, genuinely confused by this act of courtesy. In the 3 weeks since leaving Boston, no man had shown her such consideration. She had been jostled, ignored, and treated as an inconvenience at every stage station and way stop between here and there. "Thank you," she managed, and walked through the doorway he held. As she passed him, she noticed his eyes were a startling gray-green, like the color of sage after rain. He touched the brim of his hat to her, then followed her out onto the wooden sidewalk. "You need help with those bags, madam?" he asked, nodding at the carpet bag that was clearly too heavy for her. Katherine's pride warred with her practicality. The carpet bag was indeed heavy, and she had 3 more blocks to walk. "I am heading to Mrs. Henderson's boarding house," she said carefully, "if it is not out of your way." "Nothing's out of my way," he said, and reached for her carpet bag. His hand brushed hers as he took the handle, and Katherine felt a jolt of something she could not quite name. His hands were large and calloused, the hands of a man who worked with them every day. "Name's Garrett Emerson. I have a cabin about 5 miles outside of town, up in the mountains." "Katherine Rosewood," she replied, adjusting her grip on her satchel. "I've just arrived from Boston." "Long way from home," Garrett observed, falling into step beside her. He walked slowly, matching his pace to hers, and Katherine noticed that despite his size, he moved with a quiet grace. "What brings you to Grass Valley?" Katherine hesitated, then decided there was no point in hiding the truth. In a town this small, everyone would know her business soon enough. "My brother Samuel. He was an assayer here. I came to help him with his business, but I have just learned that he died 2 months ago." Garrett's expression shifted to one of genuine sympathy. "Samuel Rosewood?" I knew him, good man, honest in his dealings. I'm sorry for your loss, Miss Rosewood. The kindness in his voice threatened to undo the careful composure Katherine had maintained since receiving the news. She blinked rapidly, refusing to let tears fall on a public street in front of a stranger. Thank you, she said quietly. Did you know him well? Well enough. I brought him more samples from my claims sometimes. He never tried to cheat me, which is more than I can say for most assayers. Garrett glanced down at her. You planning to stay in Grass Valley? I have not decided yet, Katherine admitted. I suppose that depends on whether I can find employment. They had reached Mill Street, and Garrett turned left without needing to ask directions. He clearly knew exactly where Mrs. Henderson's boarding house was located. The white house with green shutters sat back from the street, surrounded by a neat picket fence. A garden bloomed in the front yard, bright with late summer flowers. Garrett opened the gate and held it for Katherine, then followed her up the path to the front door. Before Katherine could knock, he reached past her and rapped firmly on the wood. Then he stepped back, giving her space to be the first one the landlady would see. The woman who opened the door was perhaps 60 years old, with silver hair pulled back in a severe bun and sharp blue eyes that took in every detail of Katherine's appearance in a single glance. Yes? Good afternoon, Katherine said, summoning every ounce of the proper Boston manners her mother had drilled into her. My name is Katherine Rosewood. I'm seeking lodging, and I was told you might have a room available. Ms. Henderson's eyes narrowed. References? I have just arrived in Grass Valley today. My brother was Samuel Rosewood, the assayer. I have come from Boston, but I was not aware until today that Samuel had passed away. Katherine lifted her chin, refusing to be cowed. I am a respectable woman, Mrs. Henderson. I can pay for a week's lodging in advance while I seek employment. She's telling the truth about Samuel, Garrett said from behind Katherine. He was her brother. I saw the family resemblance as soon as I met her. Same eyes, same stubborn chin. Mrs. Henderson's expression softened slightly as she looked at Garrett. Garrett Emerson, I have not seen you in town for a month at least. Been working my claims, Garrett said, getting ready for winter, but I can vouch for Miss Rosewood's character if that helps. Katherine wanted to protest that a man who had known her for all of 10 minutes could hardly vouch for her character, but she bit her tongue. If his word would help her secure a room, she would accept the assistance with gratitude. Mrs. Henderson considered for a long moment, then stepped back from the door. I have one room available, $3 a week, and that includes breakfast and supper. No men in your room, no drinking, no loud behavior. Breakfast is at 7, supper at 6. If you are late, you will not eat. That is acceptable, Katherine said quickly. Thank you, Mrs. Henderson. Bring your bags in, then. Mrs. Henderson held the door open, and Katherine walked through into a neat hallway that smelled of beeswax and lavender. Garrett followed with her carpet bag. I will show you to your room, Mrs. Henderson said, starting up the narrow staircase. You are lucky, Miss Rosewood. I usually do not take in women without references, but Samuel was a good man. And if you are his sister, I suppose you deserve a chance. The room was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, a chest of drawers, and a single window that looked out onto the street. Garrett set Katherine's carpetbag down near the bed, then touched his hat brim again. I will leave you to get settled, Miss Rosewood, he said. If you need anything, you can leave word at the general store. I come into town most Saturdays for supplies. Thank you, Mr. Emerson, Katherine said. I appreciate your help more than I can say. He nodded, his gray-green eyes holding hers for a moment longer than strictly necessary, then turned and left. Katherine heard his boots on the stairs, heard the front door open and close, and then she was alone. She sat down on the bed and allowed herself exactly 5 minutes to feel the full weight of her situation. She was alone in a rough mining town, 3,000 miles from everything familiar, with no family, no prospects, and barely enough money to last 2 weeks. Samuel was dead, and she had nothing left of him but the memory of his letters filled with optimism and dreams. Then she squared her shoulders, unpacked her spare dress and nightgown, and went to find Mrs. Henderson to ask about employment opportunities in Grass Valley. The next morning, Katherine woke to the sound of roosters crowing and discovered that breakfast at Mrs. Henderson's boarding house was a substantial affair. The dining room held a long table where 7 boarders gathered, most of them men who worked in the mines or the stamp mills that processed the ore. They ate quickly and efficiently, shoveling down eggs, bacon, biscuits, and fried potatoes before heading off to their work. Katherine sat at the far end of the table, conscious of being the only woman among them, and ate her breakfast in silence. After the men had left, Mrs. Henderson sat down across from Katherine with a cup of coffee. "So, what are your plans, Miss Rosewood?" "I need to find employment," Katherine said frankly. "I have some education. I can read, write, and do mathematics. In Boston, I worked as a teacher's assistant for 3 years. Mrs. Henderson's eyebrows rose. "A teacher? That's a respectable profession. Grass Valley has a school, but I believe the current teacher is a man named Mr. Phillips. I do not know if he needs an assistant." "I will inquire," Katherine said. "Are there other opportunities for a woman in this town?" "There is laundry work if you do not mind hard labor. Some of the hotels hire women to clean rooms. Mrs. Chen runs a restaurant on Main Street and sometimes needs kitchen help." "Mrs." Henderson paused, her expression grave. "I will be blunt with you, Miss Rosewood. The respectable work available to women in this town is limited and does not pay well. Many women who come here alone end up working in the saloons or worse. I assume you have no intention of going down that path." "Absolutely not," Katherine said firmly. "Good. Then I suggest you speak to Mr. Phillips about the school first. If that does not work out, come back and we will discuss other options." Mrs. Henderson stood up. "The school is on Church Street, 2 blocks east of here. You cannot miss it." Katherine washed her breakfast dishes, changed into her better dress, and set out to find the school. Grass Valley in the morning was a bustling place, full of wagons hauling supplies to the mines, men heading to work, and the constant sound of the stamp mills pounding ore in the distance. The town had grown up quickly around the gold discoveries, and it showed in the haphazard arrangement of buildings, the unpaved streets that turned to mud when it rained, and the rough edges of frontier life everywhere she looked. The school was a simple wooden building with a bell tower and a small yard where children played. Katherine waited until the children had filed inside for their lessons, then knocked on the door. The man who answered was perhaps 50 years old, with thinning hair and spectacles. "Yes? Can I help you?" "Mr. Phillips? My name is Katherine Rosewood. I am new to Grass Valley, and I was hoping to speak with you about employment opportunities. I have experience as a teacher's assistant in Boston." Mr. Phillips looked surprised but pleased. "Come in, Miss Rosewood. Come in." The schoolroom was crowded with children of various ages, all sitting on rough benches and sharing slates and primers. Mr. Phillips gestured for Katherine to wait while he set his students to working on their arithmetic problems, then joined her at the back of the room. "I will be honest with you, Miss Rosewood," he said quietly. "I have 37 students ranging from age 6 to age 14, and I am one man trying to teach them all. I've been writing to the school board for months, begging them to hire an assistant teacher, but they keep saying there is no money in the budget. However, if you are willing to work for very little pay, I might be able to convince them to create a position." "How little is very little?" Katherine asked. "Perhaps $2 a week to start," Mr. Phillips said apologetically. "I know that is hardly enough to live on, but it is all I think they will agree to. If you prove yourself valuable, I will advocate for an increase." Katherine did the mathematics in her head. $2 a week would not even cover her room and board at Mrs. Henderson's. She would need to find additional work just to survive, but teaching was respectable work, and it was a foot in the door. "I will take it," she said. "When can I start?" Mr. Phillips' face broke into a relieved smile. "Tomorrow, if you are able. I will speak to the school board today and get their approval, but I cannot imagine they will object. God knows we need the help." Katherine spent the rest of the day walking through Grass Valley, getting her bearings and looking for additional work. She spoke to Mrs. Chen at the restaurant, who said she might need help with dishwashing 2 evenings a week for 50 cents a night. She inquired at the hotel about cleaning rooms and was told they would keep her name in mind if something opened up. By the time she returned to Mrs. Henderson's boarding house for supper, she had the beginnings of a plan that might just keep her fed and housed. Garrett Emerson was sitting on Mrs. Henderson's front porch when Katherine walked up the path. He stood as soon as he saw her, his hat in his hands. "Miss Rosewood," he said, "I hope I am not intruding. I was in town and thought I would check on how you were settling in." Katherine felt an unexpected warmth at his concern. "That is very kind of you, Mr. Emerson. I am settling in as well as can be expected. I have secured a position as an assistant teacher at the school." "That's good news," Garrett said, genuine pleasure in his voice. "Samuel would be proud of you, making your way out here." "I'm not making my way yet," Katherine said honestly. "The position pays very little, and I will need to find additional work. But it is a start." Garrett nodded thoughtfully. "If you do not mind me saying so, you have more courage than most folks I have met. Coming all this way alone, and then staying even after learning your brother had passed. That takes strength." Katherine felt her cheeks warm at the compliment. "I did not have much choice. I could not afford the trip back to Boston, and I have nothing waiting for me there anyway." "Still," Garrett said, "it is admirable." Mrs. Henderson appeared in the doorway, ringing a small bell to announce supper. Garrett put his hat back on and took a step toward the stairs. "You are welcome to stay for supper, Garrett," Mrs. Henderson called. "I made plenty of stew." Garrett glanced at Katherine as if asking her permission. She found herself nodding, wanting him to stay even though she could not explain why. There was something solid and reassuring about his presence, something that made her feel less alone in this strange place. "I would be grateful, Mrs. Henderson," Garrett said. "Thank you." The evening meal was less rushed than breakfast had been. The boarders lingered over their stew and cornbread, trading stories about their workdays. Katherine learned that 2 of them were miners, 3 worked at the stamp mills, and 1 was a clerk at the bank. They treated her with a careful courtesy now that they knew she was a teacher, and they made an effort to moderate their language and manners in her presence. Garrett sat beside Katherine, and she was acutely aware of his size and warmth. When he reached for the bread basket, his arm brushed against hers, and she felt that same jolt she had experienced when he took her carpet bag yesterday. He seemed equally aware of her, turning his attention to her frequently as the conversation flowed around them. "How are your claims doing, Garrett?" one of the miners asked. "Find any color recently?" "Enough to keep working," Garrett said carefully. "The main vein is still producing. I'm pulling out maybe 2 ounces of gold a week, sometimes more if I'm lucky." The miner whistled. "That is good money. You doing all the work yourself?" "Mostly," Garrett said. "I hire help sometimes when I need to move heavy timber, but I prefer to work alone. Too many partnerships in this country have ended badly over gold." After supper, Garrett helped Katherine clear the table, despite Mrs. Henderson's protests that he was a guest. He carried dishes to the kitchen while Katherine scraped plates, and they worked in comfortable silence. When the work was done, he walked her to the front porch. "I want to ask you something," he said, his voice quiet in the gathering darkness, "and you should feel free to say no if it makes you uncomfortable." Katherine waited, her heart beating faster. I come into town every Saturday for supplies," Garrett continued. "If you would like, I could bring you anything you might need from my trips up the mountain. Firewood for your room when winter comes, fresh meat from hunting, things like that. I know teaching does not pay much, and I would like to help if I can. Not as charity," he added quickly, "but as a friend. Samuel was good to me, and I would like to be good to his sister." Katherine considered his offer carefully. Her pride wanted to refuse, but her practical side knew she would need all the help she could get to survive the coming months. "That is very generous, Mr. Emerson. I accept with the understanding that I will repay you when I am able." Garrett's face broke into a smile that transformed his rugged features. "Fair enough. And please, call me Garrett. Mr. Emerson makes me feel like I am in church." Katherine smiled back, feeling some of the tension leave her shoulders. "Then you must call me Katherine." "Katherine," he said, trying out her name. "It suits you. Proper and strong at the same time." He bid her good night then, touching his hat brim in that gesture she was coming to recognize as distinctly his, and headed off into the darkness. Katherine watched him go, this mountain man who had shown her more kindness in 2 days than she had received in weeks of travel. The next morning, Katherine began her work at the school. Mr. Phillips introduced her to the students as Miss Rosewood, their new assistant teacher, and assigned her to work with the younger children on their reading while he focused on the older students' more advanced lessons. Katherine threw herself into the work, grateful for something to occupy her mind and hands. She discovered quickly that teaching in a frontier mining town was vastly different from assisting in a proper Boston school. Her students were the children of miners, mill workers, shopkeepers, and the few farming families in the area. Some could barely read, while others were surprisingly well educated for their circumstances. They were rough around the edges, these children, but eager to learn and touchingly grateful for her patient attention. In the evenings, Katherine worked at Mrs. Chen's restaurant, washing dishes and occasionally helping prepare food. Mrs. Chen was a stern taskmaster, but fair, and she paid Katherine exactly what she had promised. Between the teaching position and the restaurant work, Katherine could just barely cover her room and board with a few coins left over. Garrett came into town every Saturday, and he always stopped by Mrs. Henderson's boarding house to see Katherine. He brought her things he had promised: firewood that he stacked neatly beside the house, fresh venison that Mrs. Henderson cooked for the boarders, wild honey he had harvested from a hive he found up the mountain. He never asked for anything in return, and he always held every door open for Katherine when they walked together through town. This last habit fascinated Katherine. No matter where they went, whether it was the general store, the church, or Mrs. Chen's restaurant, Garrett always reached the door first and held it open for her to pass through. It was such a small gesture, but it represented something larger to Katherine. It spoke of consideration, of respect, of a gentleness that seemed at odds with his massive frame and rough occupation. "You do not have to do that every time," Katherine said one Saturday afternoon as they walked to the general store. "I am perfectly capable of opening my own doors." "I know you are," Garrett said easily. "You are capable of a great many things, Katherine, but that does not mean you should have to do them all alone." Katherine had no answer to that. She had been alone and self-sufficient for so long that she had forgotten what it felt like to have someone care about her comfort and well-being. As the weeks passed and autumn began to color the leaves in the mountains above Grass Valley, Katherine found herself looking forward to Saturdays with an anticipation that had nothing to do with the practical help Garrett provided. She simply enjoyed his company. He was a quiet man, not given to excessive talking, but when he did speak, his words were thoughtful and genuine. He listened to her stories about her students, laughed at her descriptions of the more challenging children, and offered practical advice when she struggled with discipline problems. In turn, Katherine learned about Garrett's life on the mountain. He had come to California 7 years ago from Missouri, following the gold rush like so many others. Unlike most, he had found a productive claim and had the patience and determination to work it steadily rather than gambling everything on a single big strike. He lived simply in a cabin he had built himself, and he seemed content with the solitary life. "Do you never get lonely up there?" Katherine asked one day as they sat on Mrs. Henderson's porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and purple. Garrett was quiet for a long moment. "Sometimes," he admitted, "especially in winter when the snow gets deep and I cannot get to town for weeks at a time. But I have always preferred my own company to most folks. People can be complicated and difficult. Mountains just are what they are." "I think I understand that," Katherine said softly. "In Boston, I was surrounded by people all the time, but I often felt more alone than I do here." Garrett turned to look at her, his gray-green eyes serious. "You are not alone here, Katherine. I want you to know that. Whatever you need, whatever happens, you can count on me." The sincerity in his voice made Katherine's throat tight with emotion. "Why?" she asked. "Why do you care so much about what happens to me?" Garrett was quiet again, and Katherine thought he might not answer. Then he said slowly, "At first it was because of Samuel. He was a good man, and I figured I owed it to his memory to look after his sister. But that is not why anymore." "Then why?" Katherine asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Garrett reached out and took her hand, his calloused palm warm against hers. "Because somewhere along the way, I started to care about you for your own sake. You are smart and brave and determined, and you make me laugh. You make me want to come to town on Saturdays just so I can hold doors open for you and see you smile." Katherine's heart was pounding so hard she was certain Garrett could hear it. "I look forward to Saturdays too," she confessed. "More than I should, probably. You make everything seem less overwhelming." "Katherine," Garrett said, and there was something in the way he said her name that made her shiver despite the warm evening. "I know I am just a rough mountain man with dirt under my fingernails and no education to speak of. You are a proper Boston lady with manners and learning. But if you would consider it, I would like to court you properly." Katherine looked at their joined hands, at the contrast between his large, work-roughened fingers and her smaller, paler ones. Everything about this was improbable. 6 months ago, she had been living a constrained, predictable life in Boston, teaching children from good families and attending church socials. Now, she was in a wild mining town in California, holding hands with a mountain man on a boarding house porch. "Yes," she said, lifting her eyes to meet his. "I would very much like that, Garrett." His face broke into that transformative smile, and he raised her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "Then I am the luckiest man in Grass Valley," he said simply. Their courtship was unconventional by any standard. Garrett could only come to town once a week, and Katherine's work kept her busy from early morning until late evening. But they made the most of their Saturdays together. Garrett would arrive in town just after dawn, attend to his business at the general store and the assay office, and then spend the rest of the day with Katherine. They walked through Grass Valley together, exploring the growing town. Garrett showed Katherine the best places to find wild berries in the hills above town, taught her to identify the different types of pine trees, and told her stories about the gold rush and the early days of mining in the area. Katherine shared her dreams of one day running her own school, her love of literature, and her slowly growing affection for this rough country that was so different from everything she had known. Always, Garrett held doors for her. It became a private game between them, the way he would subtly maneuver himself to reach any door first, no matter how Katherine tried to beat him to it. His long legs and quick reflexes meant he almost always won, and the triumphant look he would give her as he held the door wide made Katherine laugh every time. "You are absolutely determined about this, are not you?" she said one day, as he held open the door to the church where they had attended Sunday service together. "Absolutely," Garrett agreed, his eyes twinkling. "You told me once that no one had ever held doors for you before you came here. I intend to make sure you never have to open another door yourself for the rest of your life." "That is an ambitious promise," Katherine said, warmth flooding through her at his words. "I am an ambitious man when it comes to things that matter," Garrett replied, and the way he looked at her made it clear she was one of those things. Winter came early to the Sierra Nevada that year. By late October, snow was falling in the higher elevations, and Garrett began preparing his cabin for the long months ahead. He spoke less about his plans and more about his concerns. "Once the heavy snows start, I will not be able to get to town for weeks at a time," he told Katherine one Saturday as they sat in Mrs. Henderson's parlor. Outside, rain pounded against the windows, a preview of the storms to come. "It worries me, leaving you here alone." "I will not be alone," Katherine pointed out. "I have Mrs. Henderson and the other boarders, and my students, and my work." "I know," Garrett said, but he did not look reassured. "But I will not be here if you need me." Katherine took his hand, lacing her fingers through his. "Then we will simply have to make the most of the time we have now," she said, "and I will be here waiting when you can come back in the spring." Garrett looked at her for a long moment, and Katherine saw something shift in his expression. "Katherine, I need to ask you something important." Her heart began to race. "What is it?" "I have been thinking about this for weeks now, turning it over in my mind." Garrett took a deep breath. "I know we have only known each other for a few months, and by proper standards, I should wait longer before asking this. But I am not a man who puts much stock in what other people think is proper, and the truth is, I know what I want. I have known it since that first day when I saw you struggling with your bags and looking so lost and determined at the same time." He slid off the settee and knelt in front of her, still holding her hand. Katherine's breath caught in her throat. "Katherine Rosewood, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Garrett asked. "I know I cannot offer you the kind of life you had in Boston. My cabin is small and rough, and life on the mountain can be hard. But I can promise you that I will do everything in my power to make you happy, to keep you safe and warm and cherished. I will hold every door for you, every day for the rest of our lives together. I will work hard to provide for you and any children we might have. I will never raise my hand to you in anger, and I will never give you cause to doubt my devotion. I am asking you to take a chance on me, on us, on the life we could build together." Katherine felt tears streaming down her face, but they were not tears of sadness. "Yes," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. "Yes, Garrett, I will marry you." Garrett's whoop of joy brought Mrs. Henderson running from the kitchen, convinced someone was being murdered. When she saw Garrett lifting Katherine off the settee and spinning her around in his arms, she broke into a rare smile. "Well, it is about time," Mrs. Henderson said tartly. "The way you two have been mooning over each other, I was beginning to think I would have to propose on your behalf, Garrett Emerson." They were married 2 weeks later in the small church on Church Street, with Mrs. Henderson, Mr. Phillips, Mrs. Chen, and most of Katherine's students in attendance. Katherine wore a simple blue dress that Mrs. Henderson helped her make, and Garrett wore a new shirt he had purchased from the general store for the occasion. He had also gotten a haircut and trimmed his beard, though Katherine found she rather missed his wilder appearance. The ceremony was short and sweet. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife and told Garrett he could kiss his bride, Garrett cupped Katherine's face in his large, gentle hands and kissed her with such tenderness that several of the women in attendance openly wept. After the ceremony, Mrs. Henderson hosted a small celebration dinner at the boarding house. The boarders and guests ate fried chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans, and a wedding cake that Mrs. Chen had insisted on making herself. Katherine sat beside Garrett at the head of the table, her hand in his, and felt a happiness so complete it was almost frightening. "Are you ready for this?" Garrett asked her quietly as the party wound down. "Ready to leave town and come live with me on the mountain?" Katherine thought about her small room at Mrs. Henderson's boarding house, about her teaching position and her work at the restaurant, about the life she had carefully constructed over the past few months. Then she looked at Garrett, at this strong, gentle man who had showed her what it meant to be truly cared for, and she knew she was ready to leave it all behind. "I am ready," she said, "as long as I'm with you." They left Grass Valley the next morning in Garrett's wagon, with Katherine's few possessions packed in the back along with supplies for the winter. The journey up the mountain took most of the day, following rough logging roads and game trails that wound through forests of pine and fir. Snow dusted the ground in patches and the air grew colder as they climbed higher. Katherine had wondered what Garrett's cabin would be like, and when they finally arrived as the sun was setting, she was pleasantly surprised. It was larger than she had expected, built of solid timber with a stone fireplace and real glass windows. Garrett lifted her down from the wagon and carried her across the threshold in the traditional manner, setting her down gently in the main room. "Welcome home, Katherine Emerson," he said, and she loved the sound of her new name on his lips. The cabin was simply furnished but comfortable. There was a large bed in one corner, a table and chairs near the fireplace, shelves holding Garrett's few books and supplies, and a kitchen area with a cast-iron stove. Furs covered the floor, and more furs and quilts were piled on the bed. It was warm and snug, a refuge against the wilderness outside. That night, in the privacy of their mountain home, Garrett made love to his wife for the first time. He was patient and gentle, mindful of her inexperience, and he took his time showing Katherine pleasures she had never imagined. Afterward, they lay tangled together beneath the quilts, listening to the wind in the pines outside. "I never thought I would be this happy," Katherine whispered against Garrett's chest. "When I came to Grass Valley, I was lost and afraid and alone. Now, I feel like I have found exactly where I am supposed to be." Garrett's arms tightened around her. "You are exactly where you are supposed to be," he said firmly, "here with me. I'm going to spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret taking a chance on a rough mountain man." The winter that followed was both harder and more wonderful than Katherine had anticipated. The snow fell deep and heavy, sometimes piling up to the cabin's eaves. Garrett had to shovel paths to the woodshed, the privy, and the small barn where he kept his mules. The days were short and the nights were long, and there were times when the wind howled so fiercely that Katherine was certain the cabin would blow apart. But inside their small home, Katherine and Garrett created their own world. They read aloud to each other from Garrett's small collection of books by firelight. Katherine taught Garrett more advanced mathematics and improved his reading while he taught her how to cure venison, how to make soap from ashes and fat, and how to predict the weather by watching the sky and the behavior of animals. They talked for hours about everything and nothing. Garrett told her stories about his childhood in Missouri, about learning to hunt and trap from his father, about losing his family to fever when he was 16 and heading west to make his own way. Katherine shared memories of her mother's death when she was 12, of her father's descent into drink afterward, of how Samuel had essentially raised her and encouraged her love of learning. "We are both orphans in a way," Katherine said one snowy evening as they sat by the fire. "Both of us had to make our own way in the world without family to fall back on." "We are not orphans anymore," Garrett said, pulling her closer. "We have each other now. We are family." In late January, Katherine realized she was pregnant. She told Garrett one morning over breakfast, watching his face carefully to gauge his reaction. He stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable, and then he got up from the table, pulled her to her feet, and kissed her until she was breathless. "We are going to have a baby," he said, wonder in his voice. "Katherine, we are going to be parents." "Are you pleased?" Katherine asked, though she could see the answer on his face. "Pleased? I am beyond pleased. I am overjoyed." Garrett placed his large hand gently on her still flat stomach. "Our child is growing in there, part of you and part of me. It is a miracle." From that day forward, Garrett became even more protective of Katherine than he had been before. He insisted she rest more, that she not lift heavy things, that she stay warm and well-fed. He brought her the choicest bits of meat from the game he hunted, made sure the fire was always burning hot, and fussed over her until Katherine had to laugh and push him away. "I am pregnant, not made of glass," she protested one day when he tried to prevent her from carrying a bucket of water. "Women have been having babies since the beginning of time, Garrett. I'm not going to break." "Humor me," Garrett said, taking the bucket from her hands anyway. "You are carrying the most precious thing in the world to me. I'm going to take care of you, whether you think you need it or not." As winter slowly gave way to spring, the snow began to melt and the roads became passable again. Garrett made his first trip to Grass Valley in late March, and Katherine went with him, eager to see Mrs. Henderson and her other friends. The town welcomed her back warmly, and everyone congratulated her on her marriage and her pregnancy. Mrs. Henderson took one look at Katherine's slightly rounded stomach and declared that the baby would be born in late August or early September. "And you had better plan to have that baby in town, not up on that mountain," she said firmly. "I do not care how much Garrett knows about birthing animals. You need a proper midwife for your first child." Katherine and Garrett talked about it on the journey back to the cabin, and they agreed that Katherine would come to stay with Mrs. Henderson when her time grew near. Garrett did not like the idea of being separated from his wife, but he liked the idea of something going wrong with the birth even less. The summer was glorious that year. The meadows around the cabin exploded with wildflowers, and the forest rang with birdsong. Katherine's pregnancy progressed smoothly, and she bloomed with health and happiness. Garrett continued to work his mine, and the gold he pulled from the earth would provide well for their growing family. In early August, they made the journey to Grass Valley so Katherine could stay with Mrs. Henderson until after the baby was born. Leaving Garrett was harder than Katherine had expected, even knowing it was only for a few weeks. "You come for me the moment anything happens," Garrett said for the 10th time as he prepared to leave. "Day or night, you send word, and I will be here." "I will," Katherine promised, holding him tight. "Now go on before I start crying and make a fool of myself." Garrett kissed her one more time, long and deep, then climbed into his wagon and headed back up the mountain. Katherine watched him go, one hand on her swollen belly, already counting the days until she would see him again. The baby came on September 2nd, after a labor that lasted most of a day and into the night. Mrs. Henderson served as midwife, with Mrs. Chen helping. It was the hardest physical experience of Katherine's life, and there were moments when she was certain she could not endure another contraction. But Mrs. Henderson was firm and encouraging, and just when Katherine thought she had no strength left, she heard the most beautiful sound in the world, her baby's first cry. "It is a boy," Mrs. Henderson announced, placing the squalling infant on Katherine's chest. "A big, healthy boy." Katherine looked down at her son, at his red face and dark hair and tiny fists waving in the air, and fell instantly in love. "Hello, little one," she whispered. "I am your mama." Mrs. Henderson sent one of the boarders to fetch Garrett, and he arrived before dawn, having ridden through the night. He burst into Katherine's room, wild-eyed and frantic, and stopped dead at the sight of his wife holding their son. "Katherine," he breathed, crossing to the bed. "Are you all right?" "I'm wonderful," Katherine said, smiling tiredly. "Come meet your son." Garrett sat on the edge of the bed and looked down at the baby with an expression of absolute awe. "He is so small," he said wonderingly. "So perfect." "Would you like to hold him?" Katherine asked. Garrett looked terrified at the prospect, but he nodded. Katherine carefully transferred the baby into his father's large hands, and Garrett held his son as if he were made of spun glass. The baby, perhaps sensing his father's strength and warmth, quieted and opened his eyes. "He is looking at me," Garrett said, his voice choked with emotion. "Katherine, he's looking right at me." "Of course he is," Katherine said softly. "You're his father. He knows you." They named the baby Samuel, after Katherine's brother, and he was baptized in the same church where his parents had been married. 2 weeks later, Katherine and Garrett took their son home to the mountain, beginning their life as a family of 3. The years that followed were full and rich. Garrett's mines continued to produce, providing enough income that he could afford to hire men to do some of the heavy work while he spent more time with his family. Katherine had 2 more children, a daughter named Margaret in 1869, and another son named Thomas in 1871. The cabin was expanded to accommodate the growing family, with a proper second bedroom and a larger kitchen. Every Saturday that weather permitted, the Emerson family went to Grass Valley together. The children loved these trips to town, where they could play with other children and buy candy at the general store. And without fail, every single time, Garrett would hold every door open for Katherine. He did it when she was carrying babies, when her hands were full of packages, when she was perfectly capable of opening the door herself. He did it because he had promised he would, and because after all these years it still made Katherine smile. When Samuel was 7 years old, he asked his father about this habit. "Papa, why do you always open the door for Mama?" Garrett looked at his oldest son seriously. "Because when your mama first came to Grass Valley, nobody held doors for her. She had traveled all the way from Boston by herself, carrying heavy bags and grieving for her brother, and people just pushed past her or ignored her. I saw her struggling, and I decided right then that if she would let me, I would make sure she never had to struggle like that again." "But Mama is strong," Samuel protested. "She can open doors herself." "Of course she can," Garrett agreed. "Your mama is one of the strongest people I know. But strength is not the point. The point is respect and love, and showing someone that you care about their comfort and well-being. When I hold a door for your mama, I am telling her that she matters to me, that I see her, that I am glad to do this small thing to make her life a little easier." Samuel thought about this. "Should I hold doors for Mama too?" "Yes," Garrett said firmly, "and for your sister, and for any woman you meet. You should also hold doors for men, especially if they are older or carrying something heavy. It is just good manners, son. It is about being considerate of others." From that day forward, young Samuel began holding doors for his mother, and the proud smile on Garrett's face the first time he saw his son do it made Katherine's heart swell with love for both her men. In 1873, Mr. Phillips retired from teaching, and the school board approached Katherine about taking over as the head teacher. By then, the town had grown large enough to need a proper school building, and the position came with a salary of $10 a week. Katherine accepted, and she began dividing her time between the mountain cabin and a small house Garrett rented for the family in Grass Valley during the school year. The arrangement worked well. Garrett would stay on the mountain during the week, working his claims, and come to town every Friday evening to spend the weekend with his family. He did not like being separated from Katherine and the children, but he understood that her work was important, both for the income it provided and for Katherine's own sense of purpose and accomplishment. The children thrived. Samuel grew tall and strong like his father, with the same gray-green eyes and steady temperament. Margaret was bright and curious, with her mother's love of learning. Thomas was the mischievous one, always getting into scrapes and needing to be rescued from his own adventures. Garrett and Katherine raised them with love and discipline, teaching them the value of hard work, honesty, and kindness. One Saturday in the spring of 1876, when Samuel was 9, Margaret 7, and Thomas 5, the family was walking through Grass Valley after church when they encountered a young woman struggling with several packages outside the dry goods store. She was clearly new to town, wearing a traveling dress dusty from the stage, and she looked overwhelmed and near tears as she tried to gather up her parcels. Samuel immediately stepped forward and began helping her collect her scattered belongings. Garrett held the door to the store open wide while Margaret gathered up some ribbons that had fallen into the dirt. Thomas, not to be left out, solemnly handed the woman her reticule. "Thank you," the young woman said, her voice shaking with relief. "Thank you so much. I just arrived in town and everything has been so difficult and confusing." Katherine smiled at her with understanding. "I remember feeling exactly the same way when I first came to Grass Valley. Where are you staying? We would be happy to help you carry your things." As they walked the young woman to her destination, Katherine caught Garrett's eye and they shared a knowing look. He reached out and took her hand, squeezing it gently, and she squeezed back. They were remembering another Saturday years ago, when a rough mountain man had helped a lost Boston lady with her bags and started a love story that would last a lifetime. The years continued to pass, marked by the changing of seasons and the growth of their children. Samuel eventually decided he wanted to learn mining from his father, and Garrett took him up to the mountain to teach him the trade. Margaret announced at age 12 that she wanted to be a teacher like her mother, and Katherine began training her in the art of education. Thomas remained the wild child, more interested in exploring the wilderness and tracking animals than in any occupation that required sitting still. In 1882, when Katherine was 38 and Garrett 45, the Emerson family experienced a surprise. Katherine, who had assumed her childbearing years were behind her, discovered she was pregnant again. The news was met with mixed emotions. Katherine worried about the risks of childbirth at her age, while Garrett worried about Katherine worrying. But the children were delighted at the prospect of a new baby brother or sister. The pregnancy progressed smoothly, and in early 1883, Katherine gave birth to twin girls. Garrett was beside himself with joy and terror at having two babies at once. They named the girls Rose and Lily, and they became the darlings of the family, doted on by their older siblings and their parents alike. As the 1880s progressed, Grass Valley continued to grow and change. The gold rush days were largely over, but the town had established itself as a permanent community with schools, churches, businesses, and families. Garrett's mines were not producing as much gold as they once had, but wise investments and Katherine's teaching income meant the family was comfortable. Samuel married at 22, choosing a local girl named Emma, who was the daughter of one of the stamp mill operators. Garrett hosted the wedding at the mountain cabin, and the whole town came up for the celebration. Watching his oldest son exchange vows, Garrett felt the weight of passing time. How had the tiny baby he had held so carefully all those years ago become a man getting married? "We are getting old," he said to Katherine that night as they watched their guests dance and celebrate. "We're getting older," Katherine corrected, "but we are doing it together, and that makes all the difference." Margaret did indeed become a teacher, taking a position at a school in Nevada City after completing her training. Thomas surprised everyone by joining the Forest Service and becoming a ranger, using his love of the wilderness to help protect the California forests. The twins grew up wild and free, running through the mountains and the town with equal enthusiasm. In 1895, Garrett and Katherine celebrated their 23rd wedding anniversary. By then, they had 5 grandchildren, with more on the way. Garrett's hair had gone gray, and his joints ached on cold mornings. Katherine wore spectacles for reading, and her hands showed the wear of years of hard work. But when they looked at each other, they still saw the people they had been that first day in Grass Valley. The lost woman with her heavy bags, the mountain man who had stopped to help her. And Garrett still held every door for Katherine, every single one. It had become such an ingrained habit that he did it without thinking, and Katherine had long since stopped protesting. It was simply part of who they were, part of the fabric of their life together. One evening in the spring of 1898, they sat on the porch of their mountain cabin, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and rose. Their children and grandchildren had all gone back to their own homes after a big Sunday dinner, and the cabin was quiet again. "Do you ever regret it?" Garrett asked suddenly. "Leaving Boston, staying in Grass Valley, marrying me?" Katherine looked at him in surprise. "Not for a single moment. Why would you ask that?" "I was just thinking about that first day we met," Garrett said. "You were this proper Boston lady, educated and refined. I was just a rough miner with dirt under his fingernails. You could have gone back east, found a banker or a lawyer to marry, had an easier life." "Easier, perhaps," Katherine said, taking his weathered hand in hers, "but not better, not happier. Garrett, you showed me what it meant to be truly cherished. You held doors for me when no one else would, and you have been holding them ever since. You gave me a home, a family, a life full of love and meaning. How could I possibly regret that?" Garrett raised her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles just as he had done so many years ago on Mrs. Henderson's porch. "I am the lucky one, Katherine. You took a chance on a mountain man, and you made my life worth living." They sat in comfortable silence, hands linked, watching the stars come out one by one over the mountains they both loved. Somewhere in the forest, an owl hooted. The breeze carried the scent of pine and wildflowers. It was a perfect moment, like so many perfect moments they had shared over the years. The new century arrived, bringing with it changes and challenges. Grass Valley continued to evolve, with electricity and telephones and automobiles slowly making their way to the mountain town. Garrett and Katherine adapted as best they could, though they both preferred the simpler ways they had always known. In 1905, Mrs. Henderson passed away at the age of 92. Katherine and Garrett attended her funeral, remembering the stern landlady who had given a desperate young woman a chance and a room when she needed it most. Without Mrs. Henderson's kindness all those years ago, Katherine and Garrett might never have built their life together. Garrett finally closed his last mine in 1907 at the age of 70. The gold had largely played out, and he did not have the stamina anymore for the hard physical labor of mining. He and Katherine decided to leave the mountain cabin and move to Grass Valley full-time, into a comfortable house on the outskirts of town. It was a difficult decision, leaving the place where they had been so happy, but the mountain was becoming too much for them to manage as they aged. Their children and grandchildren helped them move, and young Samuel, now 42 with children of his own, walked through the cabin one last time with his father. "So many memories in this place, Papa," he said. "Good memories," Garrett agreed. "Your mama and I built our life here, but it's time to move on. The cabin will still be here if anyone in the family wants to use it." In fact, Thomas did take over the cabin, using it as a base for his forest ranger work. So the place remained in the family, echoing with the laughter of a new generation of Emersons. Garrett and Katherine settled into their townhouse, enjoying a quieter pace of life. They spent their days tending their garden, visiting with their children and grandchildren, and sitting on the porch watching the world go by. Garrett still walked with Katherine to church every Sunday, to the general store for supplies, to visit friends, and he still held every door for her without fail. Their love story became something of a legend in Grass Valley. The older residents remembered Katherine's arrival, remembered Garrett's devotion, remembered watching their courtship and marriage and family grow over the decades. The younger generation heard the stories and marveled at the idea of a love that had lasted so long and so faithfully. "How have you stayed so in love for all these years?" a young bride asked Katherine once, seeking advice for her own new marriage. Katherine thought about it carefully before answering. "Love is not just a feeling," she said finally. "It is a choice you make every day. It is holding doors for each other, even when you do not have to. It is being patient when patience is hard, being kind when you would rather be angry, being loyal even when life gets difficult. Garrett and I have had our share of hard times, of disagreements and challenges, but we always chose each other, chose to work through it, chose to keep loving each other no matter what." In the summer of 1912, Garrett fell ill with pneumonia. At 75 years old, his strong body finally began to fail him. Katherine nursed him through the worst of it, sleeping in a chair beside his bed, spooning broth into him when he could swallow, bathing his fevered skin with cool cloths. Their children came to help, but Katherine was the one Garrett wanted beside him. "I am not ready to leave you yet," he told her one night when the fever had broken slightly. "We still have more doors to walk through together." "Then you had better fight to stay with me," Katherine said firmly, though tears streamed down her face. "I'm not ready to lose you either, Garrett Emerson." He recovered, though it took months for his strength to fully return. Katherine hovered over him just as he had once hovered over her during her pregnancies, making sure he rested, ate properly, and did not overexert himself. Garrett grumbled about the fussing, but secretly loved being cared for by his wife. By the spring of 1913, he was well enough to walk with Katherine to church again. The first Sunday, he felt strong enough. He insisted on dressing in his best suit and accompanying her. When they reached the church door, he took his time climbing the steps, breathing heavily from the exertion. But when they reached the top, he moved ahead of Katherine and pulled the door open wide, just as he had done for 46 years. "After you, my love," he said, slightly out of breath but smiling. Katherine walked through the door he held, tears in her eyes at the familiar gesture. Some things, she thought, never changed. Some promises were kept forever. They celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary in November of 1918, surrounded by 5 children, 23 grandchildren, and 12 great-grandchildren. The entire family gathered for a dinner at the church hall, and the whole town came to celebrate with them. The mayor made a speech about the Emerson family's contributions to Grass Valley, and someone had baked an enormous cake. When it came time for Garrett and Katherine to say a few words, they stood together at the front of the hall, hands linked as always. "50 years ago, I was a lonely mountain man who thought he would spend his life alone," Garrett said, his voice still strong despite his years. "Then one day, I saw a beautiful woman struggling with her bags, and I decided to help her. Best decision I ever made. And I was a lost, frightened woman far from home, certain that I had made a terrible mistake in coming to California," Katherine added. "Then a kind stranger held a door open for me and kept holding doors for me and eventually asked me to walk through life with him. Best thing that ever happened to me." The crowd cheered, and Garrett kissed Katherine right there in front of everyone, to the delight of the grandchildren and the mock horror of the great-grandchildren. As the 1920s arrived, Garrett and Katherine entered their oddies. They moved more slowly now, and their world had narrowed to their house, their garden, their church, and their family. But they were content. They had lived full lives, loved deeply, and left a legacy in their children and grandchildren. Garrett passed away peacefully in his sleep in March of 1924, at the age of 87. Katherine woke one morning to find him still beside her in their bed, his expression peaceful, his hand still holding hers, even in death. She sat with him for a long time, remembering everything they had been to each other, before finally calling for their children. The funeral was the largest Grass Valley had seen in years. It seemed the entire town turned out to pay their respects to the mountain man who had helped build their community and raise a family that contributed so much to it. Katherine accepted their condolences with grace, though inside she felt as if half of herself had been torn away. She lived for 3 more years without him, cared for lovingly by her children and grandchildren, but everyone could see she was only half alive, waiting for the day when she could join Garrett again. She spoke often of him, always with love and longing in her voice. "He held every door for me," she would tell her great-grandchildren, "every single one for over 50 years. He made a promise, and he kept it. That is the kind of man your great-grandfather was." Katherine Emerson passed away in her sleep in June of 1927 at the age of 85. Her children buried her beside Garrett in the Grass Valley Cemetery, under a large oak tree with a view of the mountains they both had loved. On the shared headstone, they inscribed, "Garrett and Katherine Emerson, beloved parents and grandparents, together forever." At the funeral, young Samuel, now 62 years old with white hair and grandchildren of his own, stood to speak about his parents. "My father once told me that holding doors for someone is about respect and love and showing them they matter," he said. "My parents showed each other that they mattered every single day for over 50 years. They built a life together based on small gestures of kindness and big promises kept. They taught all of us what real love looks like. And now they are together again. And I imagine Papa is holding doors open for Mama in whatever comes next, just like he always did." The Emerson family continued to thrive in Grass Valley for generations. The story of Garrett and Katherine became part of family lore, told and retold at gatherings, used as an example when younger members faced challenges in their own relationships. The mountain cabin remained in the family for decades, a place where Emersons could go to connect with their roots and remember where they came from. And sometimes, on quiet Saturday mornings in Grass Valley, if you looked carefully, you might see the ghost of a tall, broad-shouldered man walking beside a smaller woman, reaching ahead of her to hold open a door that was no longer there, keeping a promise that had transcended even death itself. Because some loves are strong enough to echo through time, and some gestures of devotion are powerful enough to become eternal. The end.